Welcome to the official podcast of the Middle East Voices community. I'm Susan Yawkey.
And I'm David Hutchins. You might have noticed this week that we launched our website, MiddleEastVoices.com. Yay! It's our new social journalism and engagement platform. It's only been up for 2 days as of this recording, but we've had a couple thousand visitors. Buzzing right now is our at-issue poll on the true motivations of Bahrain's protesters. Are they aspiring for more democracy or Shia domination?
And don't forget, the site has lots of other things going on. Great reporting on the upcoming parliamentary elections in Egypt and the intensifying uprising in Syria. Go contribute and comment. Share your thoughts in discussing the most pressing and relevant issues affecting the Arab Spring and the new Middle East.
Also follow my friend Sue here at VOA Yaki. That's VOAYACKEE on Twitter. And I am at VOA Hutch.
But first we want to turn to a serious issue this week, possible nuclear weapons development in Iran. In the past week, the International Atomic Energy Agency said it had credible information that Iran has engaged in activities aimed towards the development of nuclear weapons. Tehran maintains that its nuclear program is peaceful. Talk in Washington is now on strengthening sanctions and possibly military intervention. To get started, we're joined by Michael Eisenstadt, a senior fellow and director of the Washington Institute's Military and Security Studies program, and Peter Crail, a research analyst at the Arms Control Association. Welcome, both of you.
Good to be here.
Thanks.
A new report from the UN Nuclear Agency has found credible evidence of Iranian efforts to design a nuclear weapon. What is your assessment of the UN report? Let's start with you, Mr. Eisenstadt.
The report was very useful in that it put in one place and confirmed a lot of information that had been out in the press in the past, and it also put together in one place information that had been in previous IAEA reports. In addition, there was some new information about foreign assistance to Iran's nuclear program, the involvement of this former Soviet scientist, possible acquisition of plans from the AQ-Khan network, plans for a nuclear warhead, as well as perhaps the acquisition of software for conducting simulations. So the report was very useful.
And Mr. Crail, how do you feel about it?
I mostly agree with Michael that it provided a lot of details about what we had been concerned about for some time, that Iran's been developing many of the different pieces of a nuclear weapon, or at least of a nuclear weapons program. And I think one of the important things is that this was the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, that had put its imprint on these findings, that this wasn't just accusations from Western countries saying that Iran had a nuclear weapons program that many other countries in the world might find very skeptical.
Peter raises an important point because the report notes that it was based on information from 10 different countries. It wasn't one or two countries, but 10 different countries, as well as information that had been developed on their own by the IAEA, and that's why it's particularly compelling.
Gentlemen, I have a question for you. Really want to talk about the efficacy of sanctions. I mean, Iran has been under sanctions for what was suspected nuclear weapons development for a long time. This report it confirms everyone's worst fears, and discussion is about strengthening sanctions or widening them. But it hasn't deterred Iran up to now. Can sanctions be made strong enough to actually deter it? And if not, what are the other options on the table besides military intervention?
When we talk about sanctions, we have to think about what is the role, or what are the roles for sanctions. And I think there are a number of different things that sanctions are trying to achieve. At the end of the day, one of the key roles is trying to bring Iran around and lead it to make the decision that it will not pursue nuclear weapons, that will abandon the parts of its nuclear program that would be the most relevant for weapons program. And that's something that I think that's a very high bar for sanctions to achieve just in general. There's also the additional goal of trying to slow down the program, and I think that's while the report details some disturbing information about some of the work that Iran has done on weaponization, it also shows that Iran's enrichment program, which is one of the other parts of its nuclear program that we're really concerned about, is still facing difficulties. The rate at which it's producing low-enriched uranium has actually dropped. They're still having problems developing more advanced centrifuges, partly because they can't get the parts from abroad for it because of the sanctions. So I think that keeping that secondary goal in mind is also important. And lastly, I think that if sanctions are intended to bring Iran around and have it abandon its nuclear weapons program at the end of the day, then the point is that Iran needs to come back to the negotiating table and to reach an agreement with the major countries to ensure that the nuclear program is indeed ended. So we can't leave the negotiating table out of the picture as well?
I think sanctions have had a mixed record thus far. To the degree that part of the sanctions that are being implemented are intended to disrupt and delay Iran's work on its nuclear program, I think they've been, as Peter has alluded to, relatively successful to the degree that they've prevented or made it more difficult for Iran to acquire some of the special materials and components it needs, for instance, for its centrifuges.
Gentlemen, one last topic that I want to touch about military intervention or possible military intervention. First, do you think that this report increases the likelihood of that happening? And if so, what are the scenarios of military intervention, whether it be an airstrike, and who would carry that out? And also, what do you think Arab Gulf nations, they're very concerned about Iran, its nuclear capacity as well. Do you think they are silently hoping that there will be some stronger move besides just sanctions?
We know that, due to WikiLeaks, that a number of leaders from the Gulf have been telling us, at least in private, that they would like to see the United States take care of this problem by any means that we, choose to use, including military force. So I think the U.S. or even Israel, if they were to do it, would find, at least quietly, that they would have a lot of support in the Gulf to do so. As to who would do it, right now I don't see the U.S. doing this at this point. It's very clear. Both the previous chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, as well as the previous Secretary of Defense, as well as the current Secretary of Defense, have indicated that this is not an option that they would support enthusiastically. It seems clear that the president is not committed to this course, so this leaves the matter of Israel, and it seems that there is a debate going on in Israel at this time on this issue, and it's not clear how it would be decided upon within the Israeli cabinet.
And we'll let you have the last word.
In terms of the likelihood of this report making the likelihood of military action more increasing its likelihood, I think that's not the case, because much of the information in this report details what had already largely been known. So it's not as though the report shows that there's some alarming new development that shows that some action needs to be taken in the near future. I also think that it doesn't really change the calculus in terms of what can possibly be gained from military action versus the consequences. And in terms of what's generally been discussed is some sort of airstrike by either Israel or possibly the United States, but more likely by Israel. But in that scenario, even if many of the nuclear facilities, Iran's nuclear facilities, were destroyed, it would only work to delay the program. It wouldn't end it permanently. If we're talking about airstrikes and simply delaying the program for a few years, we have to take that with the potential consequences for the region and for the global economy of any airstrikes. The impact on global oil markets, the response from Iran against the U.S. troops in the region, against Israel. And in terms of the views of the Gulf states, while it does seem that many of the leaders of the countries in the region might quietly support military action to destroy Iran's nuclear program or take out some of its nuclear facilities, the leaders would also have to be worried about the response of their own populations and the increasing instability in an already unstable region.
Well, thank you both for joining us today.
Sure. Thank you.
Michael Eisenstadt, a senior fellow and director of the Washington Institute's Military and Security Studies program, and Peter Graham, a research analyst at the Arms Control Association. The Middle East has seen many changes with the coming of the Arab Spring, but one thing remains the same, and that's humor. To speak with us about it is Adel Eskander, a media instructor at Georgetown University. Welcome to our program.
Thank you so much for having me.
With all the difficulties and challenges in the Mideast, is there room for humor? I mean, how can people laugh with everything that's been happening?
Well, I think people laugh irrespective of what is happening. I think, to a large extent, humor has been a real coping mechanism for publics that have lived under authoritarian, tyrannical regimes for so long. If you can't really oppose them, if you can't take to the streets against them, you can at least ridicule them. So satire and parody is a large part of being able to level some criticism of your leaders, and this is something that we've seen across the region. I mean, Mubarak for the past 20, 30 years had been described as the laughing cow, like the lavash kiri, the triangle cheese. So they would have pictures of him superimposed onto the cow's face, and people would refer to him as such. And so this was one way to sort of come to grips with the persona of someone who is extremely sort of dictatorial, but yet nevertheless someone who is worthy of ridicule.
But the business of comedy can be dangerous in the Middle East.
Well, absolutely. I mean, regimes dealt with humor very differently. So the Syrian government did not, would crack down on anybody who cracked jokes against the government, the Ba'ath Party, Hafiz al-Assad, as well as Bashar al-Assad, the current president. To a large extent, some countries have realized that perhaps you need to open up that faucet ever so slightly and let some steam out. So some of them permitted humor. So reactions to humor differ quite significantly. One example of that is the Axis of Evil comedy tour, where stand-up comedians from the U.S. and elsewhere, most of whom are of Arab descent and background, traveled around the Arab world to varying degrees of reaction from government. So in some instances, they're told, can't talk about sex, drugs, politics, and in some cases they weren't permitted to go into certain Gulf countries. And in other instances, it's quite acceptable because it's perceived as completely harmless. That this is just all fun and games. There's nothing to fear, and it's just young people having a good time.
Does it help the Arab Spring go forward?
Absolutely. It's important because I think humor has an incredible way of recasting the relationship between the antagonist and the protagonist. Take, for instance, what's happening in Egypt now. You've got the Egyptian sort of revolution stalling to a large extent because the Supreme Council for the Armed Forces has failed to deliver some of the demands of the protesters and the revolutionaries, and just so happens that during the Eid, one of the holiest periods in Islam, Eid holiday, the Field Marshal Hussein Tantawi, who is the current leader of the Supreme Council for the Armed Forces, went to pray at a mosque, and when he came out, his shoes were missing. Somebody had apparently stolen his shoes. And the amount of humor that has grown out of that is so remarkable. It's unbelievable. I mean, there are people taking pictures of themselves holding shoes hostage, saying, if you don't hand in the government, we won't hand in the shoe. Things of that kind have become so incredibly prevalent, but they really underlie a very interesting subversive message, which is to say that even though we can't really criticize you publicly, we're going to use humor to undermine your position. The fact that that you are at the helm here, that you're running the country. So there is sort of a subversive, critical, dissident component to it, but it poses as just laughter and fun.
Well, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
That was Adil Iskander, a media instructor at Georgetown University here in Washington. That's it for our latest Middle East Voices podcast. We're just getting going, and we would like your input to improve the show. Join our community on VOA Middle East Voices on Facebook and post your thoughts directly on the wall. Also, why not become a fan of that page and find out more about our new social journalism and engagement platform?
Or you can just visit MiddleEastVoices.com, and Sue, as you say, this show will only succeed with input and suggestions from our fans and listeners, so please join us on the website, Facebook, and Twitter, and keep the dialogue going with us and members of our team, and we'll see you next time.
Next time.